Utah. Ms. Love, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. I'd like to broaden our focus now to a consumer issue, that of debt collection, which is the topic of H.R. 864, the Stop Debt Collection Abuse Act of 2017. Every year, millions of Americans are touched by debt collection, many of them low to middle income families. In fact, the CFPB's most recent monthly consumer complaint report in June 2017 showed that the most complaint about financial product or service was debt collection, including in my home state of Utah. Within the broader topic of debt collection, I'd like to focus on the federal government's use of private debt collection and agencies to assist in its debt collecting uses and efforts. Under the Debt Collection Improvement Act of 1996, many federal agencies can, after a prescribed amount of time, refer delinquent federal non-tax debt to the Department of Treasury for collection activity by an approved private debt collection agency. In addition, some federal agencies, such as Department of Education, manage their own use of private debt collectors. Most notably, the IRS was recently mandated under Fixing America's Surface Transportation, or the FAST Act, to revive its use of private debt collectors to collect delinquent individual income taxes, and started doing so of April this year. Yet questions have been raised about the federal government's use of debt collectors or private debt collectors. In recent years, the Department of Education announced that it was ending contracts with 5 private debt collectors that have been providing inaccurate information to borrowers about loan rehabilitation programs. In addition, there are significant concerns about the IRS's renewed of private debt collectors, particularly with regard to private and consumer protection, including fears that scammers will pose as IRS debt collectors to commit fraud against vulnerable individuals. So in a nutshell, this is about making sure that the federal government complies with the same activities that the private sector when it comes to collecting debt. So I'd like to start by asking whether anyone on this panel has been tracking the most recent round of debt collectors being hired on behalf of the IRS. I know it's very recent, but do we have any feedback on that program yet? Maybe Mr. Estrada, do you know anything about that?
Well, at CRL, we do support the provisions of debt collected by third-party collectors for the federal government. In terms of the Henson case, we're still assessing the impact of the decision and how it relates to that. So I would love to stay in touch with your staff as we work through it ourselves and keep you updated on what we plan on putting out.
Okay, so just to give everyone an idea, H.R. 864, the Stop Debt Collection Abuse Act, is a bipartisan effort on behalf of myself, Representative Ellerson, Representative Cleaver, and Representative Hill to make sure that the federal government uses the same practices that the private sector uses. Also, just as a follow-up, have you tracked any other issues with private debt collectors hired by the federal government? Has anyone tracked any of those activities or thought that maybe have something that they can share?
I haven't tracked that, Congressman Love, but it strikes me that the proposal you're talking about, that particular section of the bill, is consistent with the Taxpayer Bill of Rights that I think would be relevant. And so it sounds like a pretty good approach to me.
Okay, anyone else have anything to offer? No? No, not in, okay. I'd also like to talk more generally about the role of debt collection in consumer credit life cycle. So the Federal Reserve Bank of New York recently published a report confirming the important role of debt collecting in the credit-based economy. The analysis found that restricting collection activity leads to a decrease in access to credit across the full spectrum of borrowers, and to the deterioration of indicators of financial health. So it's very important, as always, that we find the right balance between protecting consumers and making sure we don't inadvertently restrict credit availability. Just really quickly, Mr. Fisher, as the two bankers on, Mr. Fisher, as one of the two bankers on the panel, can you tell us about the significance of debt collecting and the availability of consumer credit?
I mean, we handle our own debt collection. We don't outsource it at all. So if a loan goes bad, we handle it ourselves. And I mean, obviously, if a bank takes a loss and they're not able to collect on their debts, it's going to make them less likely to lend money out again. So,
Okay, thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired. With that, we go to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Hollingsworth. Welcome, and recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for the time. And